Hi, welcome to Periergy. Today, we're going to continue with the second video of the programming course on C++. We're going to go a little bit more in depth with variables. In the last video, I showed you what is a variable and what type of primitives we have in C++. And in this video, we're going to see how to create a variable. If you don't remember what a compiler is, you might want to check out the first video of this programming course because I talked about that in that video. You're going to use this information in all the course, but in this video particularly. Because to create a variable, you need to tell the compiler two things. The first one is the type, and this is the primitives that we talked about in the last video of this course, like a boolean, a character, a string, an integer, a double, whatever. And then you have to give it a name to the variable. And this is the thing that you're going to use to retrieve the data from the variable. Now, if I were to create an integer variable, I would say int, because int is the keyword to tell the compiler that I'm going to use and create an integer variable. And you can see that it turns blue. And then you can type a name. You can just say number. There are some limitations on the naming of a variable, and we'll look at them a bit later in this video. Now you can end the line with a semicolon. This way you can tell the compiler, hey, I'm done creating this variable. In next line, I want to assign a value to this variable. Now you might imagine that not every value can be assigned to this variable because this is an integer variable. And that means that if I were to assign a character to this variable, the compiler, once I hit this button, would give me just an error right here. And you can play around and check that out for yourself. If I were to write number equals sign 10, this is the way to assign a value to my number. Now, don't be mistaken. This is not an equal sign, as you remember in math class. This is actually called in programming assignment operator. And there's a slight difference, but for now, just know that this operator just assigns the value on the right to the variable on the left. And as we saw in the last video, you can just write to the console this variable. So you can type cout, angle brackets, the thing that you want to write to the console, that's the number, and then end line. If you hit this button, the console will create. And if it takes some time, it might be because there's a problem with code blocks. So you can just hit this X. And once this console goes away, you can hit again there we are. You can hit again this button and it should be working just fine. Now, as you might imagine, once you get to a really big application, you're going to end up with tons upon tons of variables because you just need so much information to store. And all of those variables are going to fill a lot of your lines if they're like 100 variables. And therefore, C++ has come up with a way to just create multiple variables in just one line. The way to do it is create a variable like you would normally do, but instead of ending with a semicolon, you put a comma and add all the variables that you want. You can add probably infinite variables, but there's a limit, of course, which is your memory on your computer. And you can assign values to each and every one of these variables like this. And D is gonna get, oh, wow, D is gonna get a 40. And then you can write them to the console. So I want to write A, and then end line, and then I can write B, end line again, and the line, and then cout C, and cout D. And if you start the program, the compiler is going to go through each and every line of your code from the top line to the bottom line, from left to right. And for small programs, it might take a bit. And I don't really understand why it takes this long. But usually when you have a bigger application, it doesn't take this long. But if you wait just a bit, you can see that each and every value that we stored in our variables A, B, C, and D are written in this console. Now, the next thing that I want to show you is something that a lot of beginner programmers struggle with, and that is they think that you cannot change the value of a variable. And that is what I'm going to show you now. So let's create a variable. It's going to be an integer variable. I'm going to call it my number, with a semicolon. And then I'm going to assign this value, my number. I'm going to assign this value to the variable, print it in the console, my number, and line semicolon. And then I'm going to change the value of this. What am I doing? Change the value of this variable to 20 and print it again. Oh, I'm sorry. I cannot seem to be able to type today. Therefore, I didn't use two variables. I didn't have to create another variable to store the value 20. And I could use just this variable because the variable, as we said before, is just a container. And this container can contain whatever. The only restriction is that the value that it contains, it has to be an integer because this is an integer variable. And if you hit this button, the console creates, and you can see 10 and 20 with the same variable. You see, at first I gave a 10 to my variable, and then I printed 10 on the console because that is the value stored inside this variable. But then the compiler went from line 11 to line 12 to line 13. And at line 13 saw that my number changed its value from 10 to 20. And therefore, when at line 15, I wrote to the console my number again, the compiler wrote 20 and not 10. Another thing that I want to show you can do is setting a variable equal to another. Now let's create a variable. I'm gonna call it just a, and I'm gonna give it a value of let's say 20. Then I'm gonna create another variable. I'm gonna call this b, and instead of giving a number to this variable, I'm just going to give it the value stored in a. The reason I can do this is because a is an integer variable, and when the compiler gets to this line, it sees that you're trying to assign to an integer variable called b the value stored in the integer variable named a. At the end of the day, you have to know that the compiler does this. At line 8, it creates the variable named a. At line 9, it gives the value 20 to the variable a. At line 11, it then creates the variable b. And then at line 13, what it does is replace every variable that you're trying to retrieve the value from with the number stored inside the variable. So the compiler does not see b equal a, but instead it sees b equal 20 because that was the value that you stored before in line 9 inside the variable a. And therefore, if you try to print this variable to the console, you can see that b is going to have the value 20. Now that disappeared for no reason, but if you wait just a bit, you should be able to see that b has the value 20. There we are. Now we've seen how to create a variable. Now let's talk about how to initialize it. This creating a variable like this in programming is actually called declaring a variable. And initializing actually just means giving a value to the variable. Now, the way to initialize a variable that we've seen is just put it on the next line or 2 lines after and just say, hey, the variable, please assign the value 10 to the variable a. But there's actually a quicker way to do this, and that is to initialize the variable in the declaration. this. And you can do this with multiple variables as well. You can have int b equal to 5, and then, I don't know, t equal to 4. And if you write them all, you can see that it just works for each and every one of them. And of course, t is going to be an integer with the value 4, because this key also works for all of the variables that you put up the declaration of the first one. If we end this with the typing of nline, you can hit this button again, wait a tiny bit, that disappeared again, and there we are, 10, 5, and 4. Now, the last thing I want to talk about are the limitations on the naming of a variable. Now, as I've mentioned before, when I taught you how to create a variable, there are some limitation on the creation of a variable. And that's because not every character is allowed. The only characters allowed are upper and lower case letters, all of them, underscores, and numbers. But there are two rules. The first one is that you cannot start a name of a variable with a number, and a variable cannot consist of only numbers. But if a variable consisted of only numbers, this rule would be ignored, so I'm not going to write it. Now, there aren't limitations on the length of a variable, but there are some reasons you don't want to have a variable really, really long on the length. Now, if you try to play around with code blocks, you can see that you can name a variable probably with more than 1,000 characters. But the reason is, now, if you use a variable with a name longer than, I don't know, 10 characters, every time you need to retrieve the value from that name, from that variable, you have to rewrite the name again. And that's not good programming, let me tell you. Now, some bad names for a variable might be, let me create just some bad variables like, I don't know, if I put an ampersand and then 1C5, this is not allowed for some reasons. The first thing is there's an ampersand. This character is not allowed in a name of a variable, but even if we remove this variable starts with a 1. Not allowed. This variable is actually allowed because it starts with a C and then it has a number. This is allowed. And the second rule is variable cannot consist of only numbers, but you can see that it starts with a number. So this is already not a good variable because of the first rule. Thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed, please subscribe and leave a like. It really does help, and it's free, and you can always change your mind. I'll see you in the next video.